distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to join you all this morning to speak about India and the world. I thank the Finnish Institute of International Affairs for this opportunity to share my views on this subject. To appreciate how India approaches the world today, it is important to understand the changes underway in that country. I stand before you as a minister of a new government a few months after the elections. It is a government that received a convincing mandate from the people based on a strong record of delivery in the previous 5 years. This was reflected in an increase in vote share of almost 10%, not a mean achievement in any democracy, as I am sure the politicians in the room would agree. And the reason for that is that a transformational agenda is under implementation in India, one that touches every facet of life and goes beyond the traditional metrics of measuring progress. The real difference which we are making to the quality of life as much as to the quality of governance is visible as in the physical changes of towns and villages as in the mindsets of its people. Indian youth hoping for change are as enthused as Indian women seeking gender justice and fairer participation. The spread of digital network has been as energetic as the desire to enhance skills and expand opportunities. Now, these processes are reflected in numbers, and those numbers speak for themselves. 360 million new bank accounts, $60 billion in direct benefit transfers, 15 million affordable rural homes, 96 million toilets, 80 million free cooking gas connections for low-income families, 200 million microcredits, of which nearly 75% went to women, and I could go on. And these are over the last 5 years. National campaigns today target closing the gender gap, digital growth, skills improvement, smart cities, cleaning up rivers, in fact, cleaning up the country. And this is an endeavor where no region, no community, and no faith will be left behind. Now, my purpose of mentioning these changes is to highlight what is today a dominant aspect of our foreign policy, and that is to explore international partnerships that can advance these campaigns and objectives in India. For us, foreign policy has a strong developmental focus now as we explore sourcing technology, best practices, capital, resources, and collaborations with global partners. It is certainly an aspect that I believe Finland should study closely in identifying further prospects for growth in our relationship. Now, this is not a theoretical prescription, but one based on possibilities that are already being explored. More than 100 Finnish companies are present in India, some like Wärtsilä and Nokia for many years. The businesses have grown in the last few decades, but could do even more as demands increase. The urbanization of India, growth of the middle class, and changes in lifestyle will create new business opportunities. Now, these could be outbound too in services offered by Indian IT companies or on holiday resorts such as the one operated in Finland by Mahindra. As the world moves towards a more knowledge-based economy, the natural strengths of the two economies could complement each other. Slush in Finland will find a ready partner in Startup India. And then there is the promise of the future. More environment-friendly businesses like the biorefinery being set up in Numaligarh by Fortum and Chempolis, or the electric vehicle domain where there are a range of Finnish players active today in India. The talent of India and its leapfrogging strategy at home are the two natural avenues for Finnish businesses to engage. Now, India lives in a tough neighborhood and faces more than its fair share of national security challenges. Most prominent among them is the cross-border terrorism that we have been subjected to for many decades. It has cost more than 40,000 lives in the last 3 decades. We are opposed to terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and believe that there is no justification for it whatsoever. But it is not just enough to have a position. When subjected to terrorist attacks, any polity that is sincerely committed to the welfare of its people will surely respond. And indeed, that is precisely what we have done in recent years. Even the changes that were approved last month by the Indian Parliament in respect of the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, while driven by the needs of governance and development, have a national security connotation. One factor in the mandate that our government received recently was the confidence among our people in our ability to safeguard national security. We know that the epicenter of global terrorism is right there in our neighborhood. But even as we take our responsive measures, our belief is that this is not just a concern for one country, but for the entire international community. Sadly, past neglect has come to haunt many distant regions of the world. It is therefore vital that various aspects of this challenge, including radicalization, financing, and state sponsorship, are addressed by all of us collectively. Only then will we make progress. While every country has its preoccupations, there are also larger trends that shape its priorities and interests. The transformation of India that I spoke about is part of the larger rise of Asia and of global rebalancing. India is but the latest example of modernization that the world has seen. Obviously, it will have its specific characteristics, but there are some general lessons for all of us. A 3 trillion minus economy journeying towards a 5 trillion plus one in the very near future has its own implications for the world. It will be a source of new capabilities as much as of new demands. That this nation will also be the most populous society very soon only underlines both aspects. India's development is less autarkic than those of other Asian nations preceding it on the growth charts. Identifying, exploring, and capturing opportunities emanating from this growth is very much at the center of our engagement with the world. India's rise also has its outward dimensions. Some of that is visible in the operations and investments of Indian companies abroad. It is expressed through greater trade in goods and services, and it is evident in an increasingly successful and prosperous diaspora. The globalization of India has many facets, and their relevance for the world depends on the strength and focus of the partner country. How this changing India perceives the world matters more now than it did in the past. The domestic transformation that I have spoken about is, in many ways, the starting point. It creates new possibilities for international partnerships at home and abroad. The larger rebalancing that I referred to also has a cultural and political component. There is much greater self-awareness of our ability to contribute to the world, both in ideas and in capabilities. Unlike many other societies, where nationalism is a rejection of global commitments, a more self-confident India actually embraces the world more strongly. A better standing in the world is widely welcomed at home, and foreign policy resonates at the popular level. It is natural that a more diversified and multipolar world would have broader conversations. And we have contributed to that, whether it is on policy matters in the G20 or through initiatives like the International Day of Yoga or the International Solar Alliance. But even as India engages more intensively with the world, it also brings to bear its own strategic perspectives, concepts, and interests. Allow me to share some of them with you. Whether it is in growing awareness, a larger footprint, or indeed stronger connectivity and intensive exchanges, the rise of a civilizational state like India with its international traditions will have profound consequences for the world. Insofar as Asia is concerned, we believe that a multipolar world must have a multipolar Asia as its prerequisite. It is therefore critical that the rising powers like India and China find a stable equilibrium among themselves as much as with the rest of the continent. It is also important that nations desirous of playing a greater role in international affairs, like Japan, be encouraged to do so. And not least, the consensus builder of Asia, the ASEAN, must maintain its centrality and cohesion. They have been the most effective in forging a common platform for the world to gather. The role of Russia is also significant, and we appreciate that from an Asian perspective. A noteworthy element of the recent strategic discourse has been the concept of the Indo-Pacific. For India, it is a logical extension of its interests and activities to the east that accounts for more than half its trade today. The sharp separation of the Indian and Pacific Oceans were the outcome of the post-1945 situation. That has changed for a variety of reasons, including the repositioning of the United States, the rise of China, and of course, India's growing footprint. There are multiple versions of an approach to the Indo-Pacific, and harmonizing them would surely be an interesting diplomatic exercise. At the center of Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, there are also significant changes taking place as we determinedly pursue a neighborhood-first policy. This envisages a generous and non-reciprocal effort at building connectivity, contacts, and commerce in a seriously under-regionalized geography. To our west, the future of Afghanistan is the big concern, as are the choices of Pakistan in becoming a normal neighbor. The Gulf situation is perhaps an even greater anxiety for us than for Europe, given our stakes in energy, diaspora, trade, and security. What is relevant for this talk is that India is pulling its weight strongly on all these issues. When it comes to humanitarian assistance or disaster relief in Nepal, Yemen, or Mozambique, we have stepped up to the task in the realization that increasingly solutions must come from within the region. Our concern about the stability in the Gulf is similarly reflected in the nature of our deployments. The short point is that we are not only contributing to the discourse, but also to the reality of making it happen. How does India see the West? That presumably is a question that interests many in Finland. Now, we may have a complicated history with the West, but we also have a natural partnership. After all, India is a political democracy, a market economy, and a pluralistic society. It was our choices that made democracy a global norm, rather than just a Western one. We have a rich history of collaborative partnerships in the modern era with the West in general and Europe in particular. Our ties with the United States have also undergone a sea change in the last 20 years. These are only likely to grow in the years to come. There are obvious mechanisms to advance such cooperation with the West, including free trade agreements and greater civil society and economic exchanges. But it is important that there is a sharper realization of the more multipolar nature of the world and the need for more diversified conversations. New realities will lead to new equilibriums, and that, in turn, will require open minds. This is not just about politics or economics. It is also about culture, values, heritage, and norms. The era of undifferentiated globalization is over, and with it, the overconfident prescriptions for others. Admittedly, there are strong interdependencies and global supply chains, but the time has come for all of us to recognize that cultural expressions and national interests will be critical factors in the conduct of global affairs. And it is in this give and take that the new global order will take shape. The immediate future will clearly have its fair share of challenges. If Asia is witnessing multiple centers of growth, then the West has also become more diverse. But this is not just about the spread of power and influence. It is also about growing stresses on international regimes and fraying consensus on global issues. The rise of nationalism, whether it is in US, Europe, or China, has a ripple impact through the world. Indeed, we could be staring at the prospect of greater multipolarity, but with weaker multilateralism. The provision of global services and the commitment to common good will have more question marks than in the past. At a structural level, middle powers may have greater room for maneuver, and regionalism may get new energy. In some cases, there could be a return of history with reassertions of influence. All of this means a constant evaluation of the dynamic global situation and creative responses to its challenges and opportunities. Where India is concerned, our approach is to maintain good relations with all the major powers. Obviously, the degree of convergence with each one of them would depend on the issue, situation, or the partner concerned. But arriving at the best positioning and working out the most flexible method of cooperation is the diplomacy of our current era. From navigating a non-aligned world and then ensuring strategic autonomy in a more unipolar one, we have entered a world of Chinese checkers, one involving multiple players and more complex competition. It is shifting us all into a greater focus on bilaterals and plurilaterals while creating a demand for more contemporary multilaterals. While we will all naturally do our best in the games that nations play, the fundamental interdependence of our world is also a critical factor in India's outlook. Given our size and demography, we know that what we will do at home will make a difference to the world. Most of our national campaigns for change reflect the Sustainable Development Goals. And without exaggeration, it is India's performance that could make all the difference to their success. But while conscious of its responsibilities at home, India is also equally sensitive to its commitments abroad. There is much history of shared struggle as nations of the South put colonialism behind them. This, in turn, has created traditions of international cooperation that India is now building upon further. Even with limited resources, we had a policy of sharing in the past. But today, we can do very much more. With Africa, there is a $10 billion plus development assistance program underway that is supported by training of 50,000 Africans in 5 years. From the Caribbean to the Pacific Islands, our partnership programs target challenges of energy, skills, and agriculture. Just this week, we inaugurated an initiative for 1,000 postdoctoral fellows from the ASEAN to do research in our institutes of technology. These examples only illustrate the underlying reality of an India that will speak up for larger good, as it did against apartheid in the past, or climate change and development opportunities today. If we urge the reform of an outdated United Nations, our claims are not just that of record, contributions, potentials, or credibility, but one drawing on a vast reservoir of global goodwill as well. The world we live in does not lack for challenges. They range from livelihood concerns and technology impacts to the acceptance of other cultures. At a practical level, they are expressed in trade debates, supply chain preferences, mobility concerns, income disparities, and underlying them all, the assumptions and rules that shape global activities in various domains. This is an era of real transition as the post-1945 world is running out of steam. Its replacement will take time to emerge, and even then, only with much debate and not a little friction. But on behalf of a key player, I can state confidently what we can do, and equally important, what we will not be. On the challenges of development and its impact on nature, India will lead on climate change. On the power of ideas and the vision of humanity, India will support inclusiveness and diversity and will fight fundamentalism and terrorism. On the future of technology, we will leverage it creatively and effectively, but make sure that it remains people-centric. What India will not be is mercantilist, self-centered, cynical, or unreliable. It would be a partner with which Europe and Finland can build a long-term partnership, and I hope that my visit here today is a small step in that direction. Thank you for your attention.
I am old enough to have seen and experienced how European perceptions of India have changed during my lifetime. But I am still young enough to have avoided being influenced by the previous generation's perception, colored as it was when seen through the eyes of British imperialism and the tales of Rudyard Kipling and pictures of the fabulous wealth of the Maharajas. In the 60s, we became conscious of and concerned by images of appalling poverty in India and in what was then called the Third World. And some of us participated in actions aimed at helping the poor in India, such as the campaign to collect and send to India surplus spectacles from Finland. And the cry was, we have to help those most in need. Now fast forward to about 25 years later, when we became suddenly concerned by the migration from Europe to India of low-paid industrial jobs in the textile industry, for example. And then the cry was, they are taking away our jobs. And fast forward again to the Asian financial crisis 20 years ago, by which time the global economy had become sufficiently integrated for us to recognize that problems and crises in the Indian and other Asian economies would inevitably affect our exports and welfare negatively. And the cry was, we must urge them to get their house in order. Now, given our far from sterling record in managing our own economies, I am not at all convinced that our advice would have helped at all. But the point was, and remains, that we are living in an interdependent world in things both good and bad, and that, like it or not, none of us, irrespective whether we live in a superpower with nuclear arms or in a small dwarf state, can escape this mutual dependence. Any single perception of India at whatever time is inevitably misleading. India is such a vast and divergent microcosm, or given the size of the country, perhaps macrocosm is the more appropriate word, that one can find almost anything within its borders, culturally, socially, economically, ecologically, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in competition. Today, India is a valuable and important partner for all of us in Europe. And my own experience as foreign minister leads me to underline that the European Union still needs to adjust its attitude and develop its modalities to build a genuine partnership of equals between India and Europe. Hopefully, Finland can contribute as the current president of the European Union to this. Bilaterally, our countries enjoy good relations, but there are many possibilities to deepen and develop them further, be it in trade, investment, education, culture, and people-to-people contacts. India is today a global player with global responsibilities. And I'm pleased to note that Finland has consistently supported United Nations reform, including bringing India and other new permanent members to the UN Security Council, although without new vetoes, as we would prefer to see the existing ones removed as well. Size and weight are obviously undeniable criteria for a seat at the Security Council. But in India's case, we particularly welcome the world's largest democracy to take its rightful place, noting Mahatma Gandhi's heritage and your commitment to the UN's principles and contribution to the UN peacekeeping efforts. We are also encouraged to see that India is ready to take on its part for the responsibility all of us share for stopping climate change. And this is also very much in India's own as well as everyone's interest, knowing the acute water shortage, droughts, extreme weather conditions, and other climate change challenges threatening the welfare of Indians and other peoples in many countries. As chairman of the FinFund Supervisory Board, I can also point to the many projects that FinFund has been party to in India. India is an increasingly enticing partner for Finnish businesses with its fast expanding markets and rising standards of education. And as I see it, green technologies will be the field where we have perhaps the greatest potential for joint ventures in the future. The business climate in India has also improved in many ways, although foreign investors still have many wishes concerning minimizing the bureaucratic and other hurdles that they continue to face in the country. But this, of course, works both ways. As Indian corporations reach out and expand their activities in Europe, I am sure that there is a lot that we too can do to facilitate Indian investment in our countries. Indians, Europeans, and people everywhere share the same concerns on what we should do to ensure the equitable distribution of the benefits of globalization and open markets so that everyone can be a winner. The nationalist and often xenophobic my country first policies with protectionism and closed borders we see peddled also here in Europe offer no lasting solutions and can cause great damage. Instead, we must work together to preserve and strengthen the multilateral rules-based world order. And we need to engage in adjusting the rules so they better respond to people's needs everywhere. Flouting them is no solution. Interdependence in our world means transparency and openness to the international community. We have all signed on to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here in Europe, my country is also a signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights and can be indicted at the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights by anyone who feels his or her rights are not respected. And we are also open to scrutiny by others and sometimes have to change our legislation and correct our practices. Sometimes it may feel as an unwanted infringement of our sovereignty, but we have to recognize, accept, and ultimately welcome this as the new normal in international relations. The bigger the country, the harder this may sometimes be, but I urge India and all countries not to be offended by any adverse comments on their human rights record, on the treatment of individuals, ethnic, religious, or other minorities, not to mention the treatment of women, who are actually more than half the world's population, may sometimes attract. And I was very pleased to hear your comments on the role of gender equality and empowerment of women, which is really has been, I would say, the key to any success that we as Nordic countries have had in the world. And we all have to engage constructively with international human rights organizations to overcome distrust and, when necessary, reform our legislation and practices in a manner which will ultimately serve everyone's interest in today's world. Thank you.